Hello, welcome back to Expertly Weird. Tonight, we are discussing the worst scams that fooled millions of people. Now, if I told you that some of the most elaborate cons in history weren't pulled off by masterful criminals working from shadowy back alleys, but instead by trusted institutions, respected governments, and even entire nations, you'd probably think I was crazy, right? Well, you wouldn't be alone in that assumption, but unfortunately, you'd also be completely wrong. Throughout history, there have been scams so massive, so audacious, and so well executed that they managed to deceive not just a few gullible individuals, but entire populations. These weren't your typical Nigerian prince emails or fake lottery tickets. These were sophisticated operations that involved millions of dollars, countless victims, and consequences that lasted for decades. What I'm about to show you are some of the most shocking examples of large-scale deception that actually happened. These stories will make you question everything you think you know about trust, authority, and human nature itself, from financial schemes that destroyed entire economies to scientific experiments that violated every ethical boundary imaginable. These scams didn't just fool people, they changed the course of history. But before we dive into this rabbit hole of deception, let me give you fair warning. The deeper we go into these stories, the more disturbing they become. What starts as seemingly harmless trickery quickly escalates into something much darker and more sinister. These aren't just tales of clever con artists, they're examples of how power can be abused on an unimaginable scale. The Ponzi scheme that started it all. When you hear the term Ponzi scheme, you probably think of Bernie Madoff or some other modern financial criminal. But the original scheme that gave this type of fraud its name was so outrageous that it makes today's scams look like child's play. Back in 1920, a charming Italian immigrant named Charles Ponzi convinced thousands of investors in Boston that he had discovered a foolproof way to make money. His plan seemed almost too good to be true, which, as we now know, it absolutely was. Ponzi claimed he could generate massive profits by buying postal reply coupons in other countries and redeeming them in the United States for a much higher value. The mathematics seemed to check out. International postal reply coupons were indeed priced differently in various countries, and theoretically, someone could exploit these price differences for profit. Ponzi promised investors a 50% return in just 45 days, or a 100% return in 90 days. In an era when bank savings accounts offered maybe 5% annually, these returns seemed incredible. Word spread like wildfire through Boston's Italian-American community and beyond. People were literally lining up outside Ponzi's office, clutching their life savings, desperate to get in on this miraculous opportunity. Ponzi was taking in millions of dollars, which in 1920, money was an absolutely staggering amount. But here's the thing that makes this scam so brilliantly twisted. Ponzi wasn't actually buying postal reply coupons at all. He was simply using money from new investors to pay the promised returns to earlier investors while keeping a hefty chunk for himself. The entire operation was built on nothing more than confidence and the promise of easy money. For months, everything seemed to be working perfectly. Early investors were getting their promised returns exactly on time, which only fueled more investment. Ponzi was living like a king, buying expensive cars, lavish homes, and throwing extravagant parties. The local newspapers were calling him a financial genius, and politicians were lining up to shake his hand. The scheme was so successful that at its peak, Ponzi was taking in over $1 million per week. People were mortgaging their homes, cashing out their retirement funds, and borrowing money from friends and family just to invest with him. The man had become a legend, and everyone wanted a piece of his supposed magic formula. But like all Ponzi schemes, this one had a fatal flaw. It required a constant influx of new investors to pay off the old ones, and eventually that becomes mathematically impossible. The scheme began to unravel when a financial journalist started asking uncomfortable questions about exactly how Ponzi was generating these incredible returns. When investigators finally looked into the operation, they discovered something shocking. The total amount of postal reply coupons in circulation worldwide wasn't even close to enough to generate the profits Ponzi was claiming. In fact, the entire global supply of these coupons was worth less than what Ponzi was paying out to investors in a single week. The collapse was swift and devastating. When the truth came out, thousands of investors lost everything. Families were destroyed, life savings were wiped out, and entire communities were left financially ruined. Ponzi himself was arrested and eventually deported back to Italy, but the damage was already done. The tulip mania that bankrupted nations. If you think modern cryptocurrency bubbles are insane, wait until you hear about the time an entire country went completely mad over flower bulbs. This is the story of tulip mania, and it's so ridiculous that if it happened today, people would assume it was some kind of elaborate joke. Picture this. It's the 1630s in the Netherlands, and the Dutch economy is booming. Trade is flourishing, the middle class is growing, and people have disposable income for the first time in generations. Into this environment comes a new luxury item: tulip bulbs imported from the Ottoman Empire. Now, tulips weren't just any ordinary flowers. They were exotic, beautiful, and most importantly, they were rare. The Dutch became absolutely obsessed with these colourful blooms, and what started as a hobby for the wealthy quickly turned into a nationwide obsession that would make today's social media influencers look rational by comparison. The most prized tulips were those with vibrant, striped petals that created unique patterns. What people didn't realise at the time was that these patterns were actually caused by a virus that infected the bulbs. This virus made the flowers more beautiful, but also more fragile and less likely to reproduce, which made them even rarer and more valuable. As demand skyrocketed, prices began to climb at an alarming rate. A single tulip bulb that might have cost the equivalent of a few dollars in today's money suddenly became worth more than a skilled craftsman's annual salary. People were literally trading their homes, their businesses, and their entire life savings for individual flower bulbs. The speculation became so intense that people weren't even buying actual tulip bulbs anymore. They were trading contracts for bulbs that didn't exist yet, bulbs that were still in the ground, bulbs that might not even bloom. It was like a stock market, but instead of companies, people were betting their fortunes on flowers. At the peak of the mania, some tulip bulbs were selling for prices that would be equivalent to millions of dollars today. A single bulb of the famous Semper Augustus variety was reportedly sold for the price of an entire Amsterdam mansion, complete with garden and coach house. The madness reached such heights that ordinary citizens were quitting their jobs to become tulip traders. Blacksmiths were abandoning their forges, farmers were leaving their fields, and merchants were closing their shops, all to chase the promise of easy money in the tulip markets. But just like every bubble in history, this one was destined to burst. In February 1637, something changed. Maybe it was the realization that these were just flowers, or perhaps someone finally asked why anyone would pay a fortune for a plant that would bloom for a few weeks and then die. Whatever the trigger, confidence collapsed almost overnight. When the bubble burst, it wasn't a gradual decline. It was a catastrophic crash that wiped out fortunes in a matter of days. Tulip prices fell by over 95%, leaving thousands of people financially ruined. Families lost their homes, businesses went bankrupt, and the entire Dutch economy was thrown into chaos. The aftermath was so severe that it took years for the Netherlands to recover. Courts were clogged with lawsuits as people tried to get out of tulip contracts they could no longer afford. The government eventually had to step in and declare most tulip debts null and void, just to prevent complete economic collapse. The South Sea bubble that destroyed an empire. Now, if you thought the Dutch going crazy over flower bulbs was insane, wait until you hear about the time an entire empire nearly collapsed because of a company that barely existed. This is the story of the South Sea bubble, and it's so wild that it makes every modern stock market crash look like a minor hiccup. Picture this: it's 1720 in England, and the country is drowning in debt from years of expensive wars. The government owes so much money that they're desperately looking for any solution to their financial problems. Enter the South Sea Company, a business that promised to solve everything with one brilliant plan. The South Sea Company claimed they had exclusive trading rights with South America, specifically the Spanish colonies that were supposedly overflowing with gold and silver. They painted pictures of ships returning loaded with treasure, of endless profits from exotic goods and of wealth beyond imagination. The only problem, most of this was complete fantasy. The company's actual trading rights were extremely limited, and the Spanish weren't exactly eager to do business with their English rivals. But the directors of the South Sea Company weren't about to let little details like reality get in the way of a good story. They launched one of the most sophisticated propaganda campaigns in history, complete with elaborate presentations, detailed maps of imaginary trade routes, and testimonials from supposed experts. The scheme worked brilliantly. Everyone from peasants to nobles started buying South Sea Company stock. The price began climbing steadily, then rapidly, then absolutely explosively. People were convinced they were witnessing the birth of a new economic empire, and nobody wanted to miss out on the opportunity of a lifetime. But here's where things get really twisted. The South Sea Company's directors realised they could make even more money by manipulating their own stock price. They started spreading rumours about massive discoveries of gold, secret deals with Spanish governors, and upcoming dividend payments that would make shareholders rich beyond their wildest dreams. The speculation reached such insane levels that people were borrowing money at ridiculous interest rates just to buy more stock. They were mortgaging their estates, selling family heirlooms, and even borrowing against future inheritances. The entire English economy became obsessed with South Sea Company shares. At its peak, the stock price had increased by over 800% in less than a year. A single share that had cost £100 was suddenly worth over £1,000. People who had invested their life savings were now millionaires on paper, and they couldn't believe their incredible luck. The mania became so intense that dozens of copycat companies sprung up, each promising even more ridiculous returns. There were companies claiming they could turn seawater into gold, companies that promised to build perpetual motion machines, and one particularly audacious venture that advertised itself as a company for carrying out an undertaking of great advantage, but nobody to know what it is. But reality has a way of catching up with even the most elaborate fantasies. By late 1720, some investors started asking uncomfortable questions about exactly when all these promised profits were going to materialise. When company officials couldn't provide satisfactory answers, confidence began to waver. The collapse, when it came, was absolutely devastating. The stock price didn't just fall, it completely disintegrated. Shares that had been worth £1,000 became worthless pieces of paper almost overnight. The crash was so severe that it wiped out fortunes across England, from the humblest farmers to the most powerful aristocrats. Even more shocking was the discovery of just how deep the corruption went. Government officials, including members of Parliament, had been secretly taking bribes from the South Sea Company in exchange for favourable legislation. The scandal reached all the way to the top of British society, threatening the stability of the entire government. The war of the that terror worlds. Broadcastised America. Sometimes the most effective scams aren't about money at all. They're about exploiting people's deepest fears and anxieties. This brings us to one of the most famous cases of mass deception in history, and it happened entirely by accident during a radio drama that millions of Americans believed was real. On October 30th, 1938, millions of families across America were settling in for a quiet Sunday evening, many tuning their radios to listen to their favourite programmes. What they got instead was what seemed like live news coverage of an alien invasion that was destroying major cities across the United States. The broadcast was actually a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' science fiction novel The War of the Worlds, performed by a young actor named Orson Welles and his Mercury Theatre Company. but the way it was presented made it sound incredibly realistic. Instead of a traditional dramatic performance, it was formatted as a series of breaking news bulletins interrupting regular programming. The broadcast began innocuously enough, with what seemed like a normal music program. Then came the first interruption, a news flash about strange explosions observed on the surface of Mars. Most listeners probably assumed this was just an interesting astronomical observation, nothing to worry about. But then the reports started getting more ominous. Mysterious objects were falling from the sky in New Jersey. Scientists were baffled by strange signals coming from space. Government officials were calling emergency meetings. Each update made the situation sound more dire and more real. The genius of the production was in the details. The actors used authentic-sounding names for government officials, referenced real locations that listeners would recognize, and included technical jargon that made everything sound scientifically credible. They even included realistic sound effects of crowds panicking, military equipment moving, and reporters from the broadcasting scene of the alleged invasion. As the broadcast continued, the reports became increasingly terrifying. The mysterious objects turned out to be alien spacecraft. The creatures inside were described as massive, tentacled monsters with advanced weapons that could vaporize entire armies. Major cities were falling one by one, and the military seemed powerless to stop the invasion. What made this particularly convincing was the timing. This was 1938, and tensions were rising in Europe as World War II approached. Americans were already anxious about the possibility of foreign attacks, and the idea that their country might be under assault didn't seem completely far-fetched. Across the country, people began to panic. Some listeners grabbed their families and fled their homes, convinced that alien death rays were heading their way. Others called police stations, newspapers, and radio stations, desperately seeking more information about the invasion. Phone systems in some areas became completely overwhelmed by the volume of calls. The panic was made worse by the fact that many people had tuned in late, missing the beginning of the broadcast where it was clearly identified as a dramatic performance. They heard what sounded like live news coverage of a national emergency, and they reacted accordingly. Reports came in from across the nation of people loading their cars with supplies and driving away from major cities, families gathering to pray together as they waited for the end of the world, and even some instances of people considering suicide rather than face capture by alien invaders. The reaction was so intense that police and fire departments were inundated with calls. Some areas reported that their emergency services were completely overwhelmed, making it difficult to respond to actual emergencies. Traffic jams formed as people fled cities, and stores in some areas were cleaned out by panicked shoppers stocking up for what they believed might be the apocalypse. When the broadcast ended and the truth was revealed, the aftermath was almost as dramatic as the panic itself. Orson Welles and his company were shocked by the reaction their performance had generated. They had intended to create an entertaining radio drama, not cause mass hysteria across the nation. The incident sparked intense debates about the power and responsibility of mass media. Critics argued that radio stations had a duty to ensure their programming couldn't be misinterpreted as real news. Others defended the broadcast as a legitimate artistic expression that simply demonstrated how realistic and powerful good radio drama could be. What made this scam particularly fascinating was that it wasn't intentional. Nobody set out to deceive millions of people. They were simply trying to create compelling entertainment. But the incident revealed something profound about human psychology and how easily even rational people can be swept up in mass panic when faced with information that seems to confirm their worst fears. The legacy of the War of the Worlds. Broadcast extended far beyond that single evening. It became a case study in mass psychology, media influence, and the power of storytelling. It also served as a stark reminder that in an age of instant communication, misinformation can spread just as quickly as legitimate news, with potentially dangerous consequences. The Bernie Madoff Ponzi scheme that shattered Wall Street. Now, if you thought Charles Ponzi's original scheme was massive, wait until you hear about the con that makes every other financial fraud in history look like pocket change. This is the story of Bernie Madoff, and it's so outrageous that even seasoned Wall Street veterans couldn't believe the scope of the deception when it all came crashing down. Bernie Madoff wasn't some sketchy character operating out of a back alley. This guy was Wall Street royalty. He was the former chairman of NASDAQ, a respected financial advisor who managed money for some of the wealthiest families in America, and a pillar of the Jewish community in New York. When Bernie Madoff told you your money was safe, you believed him without question. For decades, Madoff ran what appeared to be one of the most successful investment firms on the planet. His clients weren't desperate people looking for get-rich-quick schemes. They were sophisticated investors, hedge funds, banks, and charitable foundations that should have known better. These were people who had access to the best financial advisors money could buy, yet they all fell for the same elaborate lie. Madoff's secret weapon was consistency. While other investment firms had good years and bad years, Madoff's returns were eerily steady. Month after month, year after year, his clients received statements showing modest but reliable profits. It wasn't flashy, usually around 10 to 12% annually, but it was dependable in a way that seemed almost too good to be true. The genius of Madoff's approach was that he didn't promise outrageous returns like other scammers. Instead, he created an aura of exclusivity around his firm. Getting Bernie Madoff to manage your money was like getting into the most exclusive country club in the world. He would actually turn away potential clients, making people beg him to take their money. This artificial scarcity created a feeding frenzy among wealthy investors. People were literally pulling strings, calling in favors, and using family connections just to get a meeting with Madoff. The harder it was to invest with him, the more desperately people wanted to hand over their life savings. But here's the truly twisted part. Madoff wasn't investing anyone's money at all. Every single trade, every profit report, every statement his clients received was completely fabricated. For over 20 years, he was simply moving money from new investors to pay fake returns to existing clients, while skimming billions for himself along the way. The operation was so sophisticated that Madoff had an entire floor of his office building dedicated to creating fake trading records. His employees spent their days manufacturing phony paperwork, backdating transactions, and creating an elaborate fiction that fooled some of the smartest financial minds in the world. What makes this even more incredible is that Madoff's scheme survived multiple market crashes, regulatory investigations, and economic downturns that should have exposed the fraud years earlier. During the 2008 financial crisis, when legitimate investment firms were losing billions, Madoff's clients were still receiving their steady returns, which should have been a massive red flag. The whole house of cards finally collapsed in December 2008, not because regulators caught him, but because Madoff couldn't keep up with withdrawal requests during the financial crisis. When too many clients wanted their money back at the same time, he simply ran out of cash to pay them. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented. When investigators finally tallied up the damage, they discovered that Madoff had stolen approximately $65 billion from his clients. That's not a typo, 65 billion with a B. To put that in perspective, that's more money than the gross domestic product of most countries. The victims weren't just wealthy individuals who could afford to lose money. Entire charitable foundations were wiped out overnight. Thousands of retirees lost their life savings. Holocaust survivors who had trusted Madoff with their money found themselves destitute in their final years. The human cost of this scam was absolutely devastating. But perhaps the most shocking aspect of the Madoff scandal was how many red flags were ignored along the way. Multiple whistleblowers had tried to expose the fraud for years, providing detailed evidence to regulators that the returns were mathematically impossible. One investigator, Harry Markopoulos, spent nearly a decade trying to convince the Securities and Exchange Commission that Madoff was running a Ponzi scheme. The regulatory failure was so complete that it raised serious questions about whether the entire financial oversight system was fundamentally broken. How could a fraud of this magnitude operate for decades under the noses of supposedly sophisticated regulators? The answer revealed a system that was either incompetent or willfully blind to obvious warning signs. The Enron energy trading scam that fooled everyone. Speaking of corporate fraud that destroyed lives, let's talk about one of the most elaborate accounting scams in American history. This is the story of Enron, and it's a masterclass in how a company can appear incredibly successful while actually being completely bankrupt. Enron started as a boring natural gas pipeline company in Houston, Texas. Nothing particularly exciting about moving gas from one place to another, right? But in the 1990s, the company's executives decided they wanted to be seen as innovative financial wizards rather than just utility operators. What they created was a web of deception so complex that it fooled investors, analysts, and even their own employees for years. The mastermind behind this scam was a guy named Jeffrey Skilling, who had the brilliant idea of transforming Enron from an energy company into an energy trading company. Instead of just moving gas through pipelines, they would buy and sell energy contracts, like stocks on Wall Street. It sounded revolutionary, and Wall Street absolutely loved the concept. But here's where things get twisted. Enron started using something called mark-to-market accounting, which allowed them to book potential future profits as current revenue. Imagine if you could count money you might earn next year as money you've already earned today. That's essentially what Enron was doing, and it made their financial statements look absolutely incredible. The company's stock price started climbing rapidly as investors became convinced they were witnessing the birth of a new type of business model. Enron wasn't just an energy company anymore, they were the future of corporate America. The media started calling them one of the most innovative companies in the world, and business schools were teaching case studies about their revolutionary approach. To maintain this illusion of success, Enron's executives created an incredibly complex network of shell companies and partnerships designed to hide their massive debts. They would transfer losing ventures to these fake entities, making Enron's books look clean while secretly guaranteeing the debts with Enron stock. The scheme became so elaborate that even Enron's own accountants had trouble keeping track of all the moving pieces. The company was essentially playing a giant shell game with billions of dollars, constantly moving money and debt around to create the appearance of profitability. Meanwhile, Enron's executives were getting rich beyond imagination. They were selling their stock options for hundreds of millions of dollars, while simultaneously telling employees and investors that the company had never been stronger. Some executives were literally cashing out their shares during company meetings, where they were encouraging others to buy more stock. The company's culture became increasingly toxic, as employees were pressured to meet impossible financial targets. Anyone who questioned the company's accounting practices or raised concerns about sustainability was quickly pushed out or demoted. Enron created an environment where asking the wrong questions could end your career. But like all elaborate frauds, this one couldn't last forever. In 2001, a series of investigative reports started questioning Enron's financial statements. When analysts began asking for more detailed explanations of how the company was generating its profits, executives couldn't provide satisfactory answers. The collapse was swift and brutal. In just a few months, Enron went from being worth over $60 billion to being completely worthless. The stock price fell from over $90 per share to less than $1. Thousands of employees lost not just their jobs, but their entire retirement savings, which had been invested in Enron stock. The human cost was staggering. Employees who had worked for the company for decades found themselves unemployed with worthless pension funds. Many had been encouraged to keep their retirement money in Enron stock, even as executives were secretly selling their own shares. When the company collapsed, these loyal employees lost everything. The Enron scandal sent shockwaves throughout the business world and led to major changes in corporate governance and accounting standards. It also destroyed one of the world's largest accounting firms, Arthur Andersen, which had been complicit in hiding Enron's fraud. The Theranos blood testing hoax that promised everything. Now, if you want to see how a single, charismatic individual can fool some of the smartest people in the world, let me tell you about Elizabeth Holmes and her company Theranos. This is a story that proves how powerful storytelling can be when combined with people's desire to believe in revolutionary breakthroughs. Elizabeth Holmes was a Stanford dropout who claimed she had invented technology that could run hundreds of medical tests using just a single drop of blood. If true, this would have revolutionized healthcare and made traditional blood testing obsolete. The problem was the technology didn't actually work, but Holmes managed to convince investors to give her company nearly $1 billion anyway. Holmes was incredibly skilled at selling her vision. She spoke in a deep, artificially lowered voice that she thought made her sound more authoritative. She wore black turtlenecks like Steve Jobs and constantly referenced her desire to change the world. She had perfected the art of looking like a tech visionary, even though her company's technology was completely fake. The board of directors she assembled was absolutely incredible. Former secretaries of state, retired military generals, prominent politicians, and respected business leaders all signed on to support her company. These weren't gullible people. They were some of the most accomplished individuals in America, yet they all fell for the same elaborate deception. Holmes raised hundreds of millions of dollars from investors by demonstrating fake blood tests using rigged machines. She would bring potential investors into carefully controlled environments where everything appeared to work perfectly. But behind the scenes, her employees were frantically trying to make the technology function, even minimally. The company's actual blood testing was done using traditional machines from other companies, not the revolutionary technology Holmes claimed to have invented. When the tiny blood samples couldn't produce reliable results, employees would dilute them or manipulate the data to make everything appear normal. Meanwhile, Holmes was being featured on magazine covers as the youngest female billionaire in history. She was giving speeches about innovation and entrepreneurship, appearing on television shows, and being celebrated as the next great American inventor. The media couldn't get enough of her story, but the deception couldn't last forever. Whistleblowers inside the company started revealing that the blood tests were producing inaccurate results that could have endangered patients' lives. When journalists began investigating these claims, they discovered that virtually everything about Theranos was fraudulent. The collapse of Theranos was particularly devastating because it involved people's health and safety. Patients who had received inaccurate blood test results faced serious medical consequences. The scandal also made investors much more skeptical of healthcare startups, potentially slowing down legitimate medical innovations. Elizabeth Holmes was eventually convicted of fraud and sentenced to over 11 years in prison, but the damage was already done. The Theranos scandal became a symbol of how Silicon Valley's fake-it-till-you-make-it culture could have deadly consequences when applied to medical technology. The story of these massive scams reveals something profound about human psychology. Whether we're talking about financial fraud, fake invasions, or revolutionary technology that doesn't exist, the same patterns emerge again and again. People want to believe in something bigger than themselves, whether it's easy money, exclusive opportunities, or world-changing innovations. These scams succeeded because they tapped into fundamental human desires and fears. They promised wealth, security, belonging, and progress. They offered solutions to complex problems and made people feel like they were part of something special and important. But they also succeeded because of systemic failures in oversight, regulation, and critical thinking. Time and again, supposedly sophisticated institutions failed to ask the right questions or investigate obvious red flags. The people who should have been protecting the public instead enabled these massive continue for frauds to years or even decades. So there you have it, some of the most outrageous scams in human history that managed to fool millions of people. From postal reply coupons to flower bulbs, from fake alien invasions to revolutionary blood tests that never worked. These stories show us just how easily even the smartest people can be deceived when someone tells them exactly what they want to hear. The next time someone promises you something that sounds too good to be true, remember these cautionary tales and ask yourself, what would Charles Ponzi do?